Hello, my name is Dina and welcome to Hop Along Studio. In this landscape project today called Living in the Moment, we're going to be focusing on how to use acrylic paints with stencils and stamps for a really effective art journaling project. And I really want to focus on the idea of living in the moment and what that can mean for us in our everyday lives. So let's get started. So the first thing you want to do with this page is decide on your imagery. In this case, I am using a variety of Wisper Designs imagery. In this case, I'm using the Nicole Wright Designs Mountain Stencils. I'm also using the Strength of the Season stamp set. I really like the sunflower and the bee, which I've actually stamped these images, colored them, and cut them out. And for the flowers, I've actually already done a demo of how you actually color these flowers. I've included it in the description below as well as the card above. And with these little bees, I basically stamped them out and then I just added a little bit of pencil crayon on them just to give them that little bit of color. So these are the main focal images for this layout. I'm also using my Dina Wakley journal for this one. This is the Denim journal. So this is actually a denim page. I've had trouble using these denim pages in my projects. I find them not the easiest to use regarding putting down paint and getting them to really work for me. So this is a bit of an experiment for me as well today to try to work on this and incorporate this into my creative practice. One thing I did do is I took a little bit of clear gesso. So this gesso, it's completely transparent. You can't really see very much here, but I have added some clear gesso in places. I haven't added it fully through the whole thing. I didn't want to remove all the texture. Instead, I wanted it to be able to take paint a little bit better. And I find with using the denim, it usually sucks up a lot of the paint. So you're adding layer on layer on layer. So my intention with this was to add a little bit of tooth to the page, to add a little bit of gesso just to help it not absorb into the cloth as much, but maybe sit a little bit more on top to make the stenciling process just a little bit easier. So the first step for this is I'm just going to add a little bit of Liquitex gesso. Often I use Liquitex gesso instead of white on a lot of my art journal pages. It's just a preference. You can totally use white paint. I just not always really consistent about it, and I have a liter of gesso, so it made a lot more sense just to use what I had on hand. With this particular one, I'm using these Art Sherpa little sponges that I got. They're supposed to be great for adding paint to your layouts through a stencil, so we're going to give this tool a try. This is a tool I have not actually tried using before, so it's going to be a little bit of an experiment. So in this case, I think I like layering the mountains a bit, so I think I'm just going to put this one in behind, and we're just going to start by adding some color down. So you can see just as it is, the denim doesn't really work the same way as a lot of other paints do. You don't get the same level of coverage. The intention is to let some of that fabric design through, but it can be hard when you're maybe trying to do a little bit more of a landscape. I'm going to try to make it work for me, but something to be aware of when you're using this particular denim fabric, that it is going to be a lot more work just to get things to stay where you want it to, and that has to do again with that denim fabric, that surface that is a little less forgiving. Okay, and if I dab these a bit harder, then I actually get it to add a little bit more paint through. And so with that one, it actually ended up trying to get the paint through. It kind of ended up seeping underneath the stencil, but I don't necessarily mind that. And then it's going to line that up like so. I'm trying to be a little bit more careful this time, not to press too hard, and maybe just allow that to be a little bit more of the texture that the fabric has, just so that I don't end up losing too much of the definition from the stencil. And that's why I wanted to show you this particular surface today. It's not an easy surface to work off of. I know a lot of people, I've seen even online, people going, well, how do you use this journal? How do you make it work for you? So I'm doing my take on it. This isn't necessarily the best or the right way of doing things. I just thought I would give you an option and something to maybe try yourself and see if maybe this technique might work for you as well. You can see how the denim, if you actually just kind of rub it on the top, you can end up getting some kind of fun mark making. By actually letting that texture kind of come through, you can actually do something kind of fun there. So that didn't completely work. I was hoping that mountain would show up a little bit better, but I think I'm going to start by adding a little bit more paint and see what I can do to add a little bit more definition to this. And I'm going to try to use some Hickory Smoke Distress paint and see kind of how that goes. I'm also going to be using a different Sherpa sponge. And this is a little bit more of a fluid paint, so we'll see if this differs kind of the look that we get out of this. And I'm okay with it kind of going past just where the mountains are. It's actually in the mountains earlier in the week, and I have to say I was very inspired to try to add mountains into my layout this time around. I ended up having some mixed weather, some good weather and some bad weather. I had some rain, but then ended up turning to blue skies and being beautiful. So you can see I've left these a little bit more white, I left these a little bit more gray, and overall it works really well. And I'm actually just going to take a heat tool to this really quickly, make sure it's fully dry before we move on. So now I'm just going to start adding a little bit of background color to this. I want the idea of mountains and then maybe like some meadow in front, because I think that's where I'm going to start adding in our sunflowers and our little bees. And the idea of it is not to make it just one-dimensional. It's trying to get a sense of depth and distance in this. So I'm using a little bit of this cadmium green hue and a little bit of this Phtalocyanine emerald. That's a mouthful. And I'm just taking my brush. And when you're actually using a brush, when you're using something that you don't want to necessarily have a ton of water on, you want your brush to be wet. You don't want it to be too wet. So sometimes I dab it off very lightly on a piece of paper towel. I grab a little bit of my paint, like so. And if you find the paint's a little thick, that's where you can dip into some water and just mix it in a little bit just to get it flowing a little bit more. And I was taking a pixilation class this weekend, so I've been really getting into the idea of adding pixilation or a lot of those stronger making marks to my projects. So I'm going to try doing a little bit of that today as well. But you can see the denim kind of just sucks up the paint. It doesn't really let it stay on the surface. So compared to using watercolor paper or anything else, it does require a completely different technique. I think this would work a lot better for spray paint specifically because it'll stay a little bit more on the surface. And again, I'm not really picky here about getting it perfect coverage. The idea is to let some of that blue go in. I'm actually thinning down this light green a little bit more. In this case, I'm using a lot of my Pebeo Studio Acrylics. I like them because they have pigment in them. They work really well for this type of work, and they're not expensive compared to a lot of the other paints that are available. I generally try to use a paint that I know has good pigment in it. It isn't as important when you're working in a journal just because your journal's not going to see as much light, but I think just on principle I like trying to use the same types of paints that I use in my canvas work as I do in my journals. And part of that is just so that I can get familiar with the medium. It comes a bit more naturally, and I don't have to struggle with it when I'm changing surfaces. But again, always stick to what you can afford. If all you can afford is craft paint, buy craft paint. If you can afford a little bit better paint than craft paint, give some other paints a try. Again, really, it's about creating. It's not necessarily about having the perfect materials. I know some people are very specific about materials. And I think if you're selling your work for several $1,000s for a painting, yes, then you should be very concerned about making sure there's longevity to your paint and the surfaces you're working on. But when you're working in an art journal for your own pleasure, it's a little bit of a different animal. So just ended up just adding a little bit of color down. Again, I'm going to dry this again. I'm finding because this does seep through a bit on the other side, it hasn't really too badly. I've been going fairly light-handed, but you want to make sure it's fully dry before adding your next set of color. So sometimes when you add a layer, the next thing you want to do is just try to add all of your pieces in and figure out, do you like how it's looking? Is it giving you the effect you want? Or do you want to do something else? In this case, I kind of like where this is going. I actually like how kind of painterly that background's feeling. So I think I want to add a little bit more texture to it. So I'm going to add this Ciao stencil in places. Not the whole thing, just some places along the bottom to kind of give that sense of stems. Because again, we're trying to think of this as being really forward, this being in the background, and this even being further out. So by trying to add these layers and by changing just the depth of your color and even how much detail there is, because again, the background is going to the further things get away, the less, usually the more gray they get, the less detailed they get, which is actually why having these mountains not totally work out actually works almost better for giving that sense of distance. But then close up, you want to be able to see those details, like some of the stems on the sunflower. So I'm going to add a little bit of this stencil with some acrylic paint, and then we will continue to add more layers. So in adding the stencil, I just added a few colors to my palette, and I'll mix them a little bit together. So we have some green gold. The green gold is pretty transparent, so actually it's working pretty well. Oh, so here we go. By adding slightly more transparent paints on the denim, it seems like it will actually kind of stick out the way I really want it to, which is surprising. I wasn't expecting it to actually do that. Add some phthalo green in there. Again, it's meant to be subtle. It's not meant to be really strong. This is meant to add a little bit of texture. And this particular stencil has the bulrushes, and I'm trying to keep that out of the design. I specifically chose the stencil just because of the fact that it does have some of those fun greenery bits, but I don't always want to use bulrushes in my painting. But the nice thing about it is because they have all of this fun texture down here, it's something that you can easily just add into places. And again, it gives that more sense of there's grasses, there's something else going on there. Just fixing that horizon a bit. I don't want a ton of white showing through there. I don't mind it being lighter, but not everything is going to be covered up, so I do want to have that line to not look like there's been a lot of weird white spots hanging around. I want to go with a slightly different green in here as well, so I want to actually throw a little bit of the white gesso down and mix a slightly different color. So that's kind of a phthalo green in there, adding a touch of that lighter green. So everything is kind of getting more atonal. It's all kind of one tone, so by doing this, it's kind of mixing it up a little bit. More of that green gold. Yeah, the green gold has a nice way of kind of sticking out a little bit. Green gold is a great color for landscapes. So I thought I might want to add a little bit more to the sky. I don't want to go too crazy. But I was thinking that maybe a little bit of this bluish gray and this cadmium yellow might be a nice combination. So you don't want to load too much of it on your paintbrush. That might be nice to try to... Sorry, I saw some green in my paintbrush. Green seems to always hang out in there a little bit longer than any of the other colors. And it's going to mix a little bit of the yellow in there as well. It'll look like kind of a soft sky. Just throwing a little bit of white on top. Still want to try to keep that soft, but when you're doing this technique, try just using a flat brush and go one way or the other. Don't go like this by creating almost a more pixelated look to it. It's something I've been doing more in my work. I've been taking some classes on pixilation, and I do enjoy the look of it. I can add some interest to that background, and just having those slightly stronger marks can just add a little bit of interest to your art journal page. Also, the idea is not to have too much of the same thing going on everywhere. I tend to do that in my paintings. I do the same thing everywhere. So I'm really trying to break out of that habit. I'm just lightening up around those mountains a little bit. I don't want them to lose those edges. I want to make sure that they're still quite well defined. So I'm just making it look like there's a bit of low cloud. I think that looks a little bit better. So by having started with the gray and then adding these colors on top, it gives you a much more painterly feel to that background. And now you have like the little bit more definition with the greenery in front. And now we're going to add in, I love this page just as it is, but I feel like I want to try to add in some of the journaling and the other things I wanted to do. So again, you can always stop here, but if you want to add a little bit more, we can go from there. So now I'm kind of working on the placement of some of my flowers. I was originally going to have a lot more flowers on here, but now that I have this wonderful texture background, I think I'm going to go a little bit later on them than I planned originally. So I'm just going to add a little bit of this glitter glue to the back. It's not actually, it's called art glitter glue. So it's not actually glitter glue, it's a clear glue. I always think of calling it glitter glue just because it's Art Glitter is the name of the company. And then I'm just going to add these on. I'm actually going to adhere all of my embellishments, and I'm just going to move on to the next step here, where I'll show you where we want to go next from here. So that we've glued down a lot of our elements, I've decided to just use 5 of the sunflowers, added a few of the bees, and then the living in the moment was my saying, or the thought that I wanted to talk about today. And with the living in the moment, I used the brush script Wisper Designs stamp set for stamping these out, and then I outlined them with a pen, and then the ledger and script for doing the letters as well too. I like sometimes changing my letter size and using 2 different fonts when I'm having my statement that I want to talk about. And then what I want to do now is just start adding in some more stronger lines that are going to be the stalks of the sunflowers. Even though I do have this beautiful kind of greenery in the background, I don't really feel like these are grounded, so I just am going to add some lines. And I'm just kind of sketching in stuff lightly. What you'll notice about sunflowers is they actually do have leaves that kind of go off in a strong stalk, and then they kind of have that fun leaf shape. And they kind of almost bow out. So I'm just going to be putting in these very loosely, and then I will decide how I want to try to make them stand out a little bit more. And so with the living in the moment, why I was kind of focused on the idea of living in the moment, maybe it was just being in Banff and in the park, it was so interesting to see how many distracted people there were. They would take a very quick glance at the beautiful scenery around them, like for example at Lake Louise, and they would spend the next 10 minutes posing for their next Instagram shot. And you know what? There's nothing wrong with having your picture in front of things, but what I found so interesting was that they took 2 seconds to look at the mountain, or took 2 seconds to look at what was around them, and spent the rest of the time figuring out how they would capture it instead of actually looking at what was around them. And this is something that I've really worked on, because I used to be more like that, where I used to be like, oh, that's cool, let's go take a picture, let's move on. And now it's been a work of trying to be more mindful, be more aware of what's around me, and just enjoy the beauty of the moment. And even this trip that we went on just for the day to the mountains, when my husband asked me what I wanted to do, so it was actually for my birthday, I told him I just kind of wanted to get on the road and see what happened. I didn't even want to plan where we would go or what we would see. And because of that, we ended up having just a fabulous day, because we saw so many things that we hadn't planned to see. Just because the weather cooperated, we were able to actually go in and see things. And it was a really fun and exciting way of spending the day, because I had nothing planned. And it was meant to be extremely relaxing. And so I think for many of us, I know myself included, it's so easy to get into the planning. I love to plan. But sometimes it's taking the time just to be. View the things around you. Take it one step at a time. Don't have a plan in mind. Just see what will happen. And it's amazing the beautiful experience you may end up because of the fact that you haven't been in such a rush. And you never know what you'll experience that might be the one thing that was like the best part of that day that you would have missed out on if you had been in a huge hurry. So I think for us, it's often being very intentional in how we approach our experiences. Do we rush through? Do we have 5 things booked? Or do we go, well, I'm going to have one thing today and I'm really going to enjoy it? And that's been another thing that I have done in the last while. I've not had so many things. I usually say like every day gets one positive thing to look forward to. And that's really helped me as I've been trying to just take a lot of the busy and a lot of the rush out of my life. And by savoring those moments and seeing the beauty in the little things, it's amazing what can kind of come of it. So I really wanted to talk about the idea of living in the moment. I wanted to really focus on being able to remind myself, like, keep living in the moment. Don't rush. Don't be in such a hurry that you miss out on some of the most beautiful things in your life. So now I've added in these very loose sunflowers. I'm trying to decide if I want to color them in or not. Maybe I'll add just a few highlights in places just to have them stick out a little bit more. But again, I don't want to have them be too strong. The intention was to keep this a little bit softer between the sky and the stencil. I don't want really super strong symbolism. I know these are quite strong, but I don't want this to be really, really strong feel to it. So I'm pulling out my really fine little square paintbrushes, and I'm not painting everything. That is the key with this, is we're not painting every leaf all the way through. So I'm going to take a little bit of the white paint, mix it with the green gold just to get it nice and a little bit more opaque, because the green gold can be quite transparent. And I'm just going to add little marks. And I really should have done this before I put in my words and put everything down, but that's okay. I'll kind of work with it as it is. And I'm not being perfectly in the lines either. Because again, if you keep perfectly in the lines, then it makes it look very strong in that way. And this way, it kind of keeps it very painterly and a little bit more looser. So again, this is not about perfectly in the lines. This is not about going all the way through. It's just helping it pop a little bit. Makes it look like I'm adding tiny little highlights. Sorry if my hair or my head's getting in the way. I'll add a tiny bit of that phthalo green in there too. I'll mix the two together, see what happens. Okay, yeah, so I think that's better. That adds that little bit of something so that it's not just a black outline, but it also kind of makes it look like it's part of the background instead of being something really stark as well. I hope you've enjoyed this art journal project and learned something new today. I know I use a few different materials. I don't usually use denim as my surface for my art journaling project, so I did learn a few things today just even as I was filming this video. And I hope that you've learned something new maybe about acrylic paint that you can also use in your creative practice. If you have enjoyed this video, if you could like it, subscribe to my channel, and provide a comment below about what you liked about this video. Also hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any future videos. Also, there's my website, hopalongstudio.com. There I usually go a little bit more into the self-care aspect of each of these videos. You can also find pictures and written instructions for each of these videos there as well. And if you are interested in any of the products that I used today from Wisper Designs, you can use DT Nadine at checkout on their website to get 10% off your next order. I hope that you have a really great week and you take some time for some creative self-care. I'll see you next time.